Okay, 9:31, it's time to begin. Each of you gives me the joy of teaching and sharing what I have been studying. And this morning, Psalm 78 has a lot to study. But because most of you were here yesterday, I just want to pause before I read this psalm to say how the Psalms sometimes have a certain mystery in terms of how they are paced. So, just over the last week, 75 and 76 had this kind of messianic feel. The world was good. The kings were coming at the end of Psalm 76, recognizing God as good and bringing tributes, good in that he was the God of justice. And then 77, yesterday, we had the psalmist moaning with questions, unable to sleep at night. Where is God? And then the second half of that psalm, kind of a display of God's goodness of the past, but a bit poetically unresolved at the end. Did that solve the psalmist's problem of sleeplessness, or did it continue? Or in and out? Today, the problem is not God. Today, the problem is the people. It's a lengthy overview of Jewish history from the time of Moses to the time of King David. I say time of because unlike Psalm 77 yesterday, which ended with mention of Moses and Aaron, his servant, here in this lengthy display of history, no mention of Moses, no mention of Aaron explicitly, though there will be the mention of David. Some see this psalm as a historical overview in order to point to David as the culmination of that history. There will be twice the image of God as shepherd of the people, and the same language will be used twice at the end of this psalm to describe David, the shepherd of the people. And so for Art Scroll, the pronouncement of David as eternal king is the goal of this psalm. At the outset, you'll see that the goal of this psalm is to teach memory, not history, memory that will be conveyed to the next generation, a memory that hopefully will break a pattern. What's the pattern? The pattern is God does miracles, caregiving, and the people disingenuously pay homage and then flip against God, constantly rebelling against God, remembering God after being punished, and then turning back to God, but somehow it doesn't stick. And so the focus of this psalm is conveying a memory to be given to the future generation that they will give to their children and to their children, so that there will be, from the psalmist's point of view, a fidelity to God. All right, there's a lot more to be said about the psalm, and I will do so in our little discussion after. But because it's a long psalm, I will also add that the psalm will go back and forth in that history. It'll have certain details that aren't elsewhere in the Bible, like the details of the plague of hail and what happens. Though here there will only be 7 plagues, not 10. More to the puzzle as we begin. Puzzles concerning days of old. A maskil of Asaph. Give ear, my people, to my Torah. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open with a proverb my mouth. I will utter puzzles concerning days of old, that which we have heard and known, and our ancestors told us. We will not conceal from their children. to the generation after, telling praises of Adonai and God's strength and wonders which God had worked. For God established a testimony in Jacob and Torah placed in Israel, which God commanded our ancestors to make known to their children, for the sake that they should know a generation after the children that will be born, who will rise and tell their children, that they might put in God their confidence and not forget the deeds of El and God's commandments they should keep, and not be like their parents' generation, stubborn and rebellious, a generation of an unset heart, who were unfaithful to El, of their life breath, the children of Ephraim, armed with and shooters of bows, who turned back on the day of battle. They did not keep the covenant of God, and in God's Torah refused to walk. And they forgot God's doings and wonders that God had showed them. In the sight of their parents, God worked wonders in the land of Egypt, the field of Zoan, split the sea and caused them to pass through. And God made to stand the waters as a heap, and led them with a cloud by day, and all the night with a light of fire. God split rocks in the wilderness, and gave drink like the abundant depths. And God brought streams out of the rock, and caused descent as rivers of water. Yet they continued more to sin against God, to rebel against the Most High land. And they tested El in their heart by asking for food for their spirit. And they spoke against God. They said, "Is it possible for God to prepare a table in the wilderness?" Behold, God struck the rock, and waters flowed out, and streams gushed forth. But also bread? Is God able to give it, or provide meat for God's people? Thus Adonai heard and was enraged, and a fire flared against Jacob, and also anger rose up at Israel. For they did not believe in God, and did not trust in God's deliverance. And God commanded the skies above, and the doors of heaven opened up, and God rained on them manna for food, and the grain of heaven God gave them. Bread of the angels a person ate. Provisions were sent to them to satiate. God moved the east wind in heaven, and drove with God's strength the south. And God rained on them like the dust meat, and as the sand of the seas winged fowl. And God made them fall into the midst of their camp, encircling their dwellings. So they ate, and were sated very much. And their craving God brought to them. They did not desist from their craving. Their food was yet in their mouths when the anger of God rose against them, and slew those fattened among them. And the young people of Israel brought low. For despite all this, they sinned still, and did not believe in God's wonders. And God ended as a breath their days, and their years in terror. When God slew them, then they sought out God, and turned back, and eagerly searched for El. And they were called, for God was their rock, and El most high their Redeemer. But they beguiled God with their mouth, and with their tongue lied to God. For their heart was not steadfast with God, nor were they faithful with God's covenant. But God is compassionate. V'hu rachum yachaper avon v'lo yashchit v'herba l'shiv apo v'lo ya'ir kol chamato. But God is compassionate, forgives iniquity, and does not destroy, and repeatedly turns away anger, and does not arouse all God's fury. And God remembered that they were but flesh, a breeze that goes off and does not return. How often did they rebel against God in the desert, and cause God grief in the wilderness? And they turned back, and they tested El, and of the Holy One of Israel demanded signs. They did not recall God's hand the day God redeemed them from foe, who set in Egypt God's signs and his wonders in the field of Zoan, and turned into blood their rivers, and their flows they could not drink. God sent among them swarms, which devoured them, and frogs, which destroyed them. God gave to the grasshoppers their crops, and their labor to the locust. God destroyed their vines with the hail and their sycamores with the frost. God confined with the hail their livestock and their flocks to fiery bolts. God sent against them God's smoldering fury, anger, indignation, and trouble, a band of messengers of harm. God leveled a path for God's fury, did not spare from death their spirit, but their life was foreclosed to pestilence. And God struck all the firstborn in Egypt, first fruits of their vigor in the tents of Ham, and then led forth like sheep God's people and drove them like a flock in the wilderness. And God guided them to safety. And they did not fear, for their enemies the sea had covered, and God brought them to a border of God's holy place, a mountain, this acquired by God's hand, and God drove out the nations before them, and apportioned them with measured inheritance, and caused to dwell in their tents the tribes of Israel. Yet they tested and rebelled against God Most High, and God's testimonies they did not observe, but they turned back and dealt treacherously like their parents. They flipped around like an untrustworthy bow, provoked God with their high places and with their graven images, moved God to jealousy. God heard and was wroth, and God despised greatly Israel, and God abandoned the tabernacle of Shiloh, the tent where God had dwelled among mortals, and gave into captivity God's strength and God's glory in hand of foe. God confined to the sword God's people, and with God's inheritance was enraged. Their young men fire devoured, and their young women had no marriage song. Their priests by the sword they fell, and their widows did not weep. Then God awoke as if asleep, my supreme, like a warrior rousing himself with song from wine. And God smote God's foes into retreat. Shame unending God placed on them. And God despised the tent of Joseph. And the tribe of Ephraim did not choose, but chose the tribe of Judah and Mount Zion, which God loves. And God built like the heights, God's holy place, like the earth that God has founded forever. And God chose David, God's servant, and took him from the sheepfolds, from following suckling lambs. God brought him to be a shepherd among Jacob, God's people, and Israel, God's inheritance. And he shepherded them with integrity of his heart, and with skillful palms led them. All right, a longer psalm, filled also with much emotion. You might wonder, what is this reference to Ephraim? Ephraim gets mentioned twice as the tribe that had proven itself, first in verse 9. Got to go a long way to scroll. The children of Ephraim, armed with and shooters of bows, who turned back on the day of battle. That verse 9, does not appear directly in Torah as a story. There is no such story. There is, in a chronology, 1 Chronicles 7, verses 20 to 22, which Rashi will identify. And note that the sons of Ephraim will be killed by the people of Gath for trying to steal cattle. But it's not clear what this is about. But what is clear is that Ephraim is the son of Joseph, and Ephraim is the largest of the 10 tribes to the north. Sometimes the 10 tribes in the north, who will split from the 2 tribes in the south, with Judah being the main tribe of the south, the 10 tribes will be referred to, as in Jeremiah, as Ephraim. And again, this is a trajectory in which David is elevated. He becomes as eternal as the earth itself in that closing image. And so here in verse 9, you'll have reference to Ephraim, who proved untrustworthy. And the psalmist will return to this image in verse 67, way back at the end. And God despised the tent of Joseph, and the tribe of Ephraim did not choose. And so some scholars will place this as a very early psalm, even during the time just after David or in the time of David, because Ephraim is still, if you will, part of the consciousness, and the need to present David as the endpoint of a trajectory of a turbulent history, that the temple will be built in Jerusalem through King David by his son Solomon, is around the period that some would ascribe this psalm to. And here's one other kind of detail that points to a very early composition that Benjamin Siegel points out, in that, as we see in biblical Hebrew, there's two tenses: perfect, which is usually present and past, and imperfect, which is present and future. Rarely is the imperfect also used to describe the past. But that's the nature of many of the verbs in this psalm, which Benjamin Siegel says was true for Ugaritic poetry. That's the poetry of the ancient Near East, which would also make this an early psalm linguistically. So here's a bit of the overview. We got the plagues, we have the split sea, we have this story alluded to from the book of Judges of the ark being taken by Israel's enemy. That's the Philistines. And God punishes the Philistines for having taken the ark. And then we have David. But these things are a bit out of order. For instance, the meat that God brought is described early on, but that's not till the book of Numbers. And therefore, there's a sense of an emotional flow of God being the provider for the people, but mixing, if you will, the timetable of these respective acts of caregiving. In my introduction to the psalm today, I wrote about the difference between memory and history, as Yosef Yerushalmi, the great historian who taught at Columbia, pointed out in what was a series of 5 lectures that he gave at the University of Washington in Seattle that got then published as a book called Zachor. And he points out the obsession of the Bible with the need to remember. Zachor, a word that's repeated 169 times. When people, now I'm going fast forward, asks about why Jews are so fascinated by remembering the Holocaust, as an example. No people has built so many museums to remember a story of sorrow as the Jews have done with Holocaust museums. It's because embedded in Bible is this obsession with memory, as this psalm, to remember in order to. When we tell the Passover story, we don't remember in order to only be pained by the past and to be victims, but rather we remember in order to make sure that all peoples are liberated. And we remember in order to remember that we have a relationship with God that leads to a covenant. And so memory is not history. History is the recording of events chronologically, trying to be accurate with detail. There, of course, being an editorial context as to which events lead to what events. At the same time, memory has as its key focus not to record the past, but to evoke lessons from the past. And that's clearly the case of Psalm 78. It's a psalm about memory, but it is in the form of puzzles, in the sense that there's a number of things that, give you pause to wonder. Let me give you a couple of examples. You have mention in verse 12 of Zoan. that comes to the foreground. It's in two different verses in this psalm. I will say Zoan is mentioned twice in the Bible before, once in Numbers, but it's in the context of identifying it as a place that's even older than Hebron. That's in Numbers 10:22, but doesn't say anything about what it is other than being in Egypt. In Isaiah chapter 30, verse 4, Isaiah is chastising those officers who have fled seeking refuge in Egypt and are present in Zoan. And here's just a silly aside. Zoan is not Zohan of the TV show You Don't Mess with the movie. You Don't Mess with the Zohan, the 2008 movie. That's Zohan. This is Zoan. Okay, that's just an aside. This is an example of something that appears, a detail in this story that here might be poetically symbolic in terms of representing Egypt rather than describing an event, because no event was mentioned. I, as you know, do something somewhat idiosyncratic, which is I like to count the words and see what is the bullseye, what's at the very center. This psalm has 530 words. Its middle word is the last word of verse 34, El, God. And look what comes before it. And eagerly searched for El, and they recalled. 34, 35, the bullseye, the center of this psalm is when the people repented, shavu, and eagerly searched for God. The whole trajectory of this psalm is to teach the people, look for God, return to God, then be steadfast. And that again is the absolute bullseye in the word count of this psalm. If it's intentional, I don't know, but this psalm, as all the psalms, is so precisely written using obscure words that I would surmise that it is purposeful. Now here's a source of some scholarship. Here, beginning with verse 41 to 42, the people, they demand signs. That also is an obscure word. Hitvu only appears in Ezekiel 9:4 when the good people, during a time of rebellion, put marks on their head so that they would be safe. So, and the hit vitatav, tav is a mark. They demanded signs. So here becomes a description of the plagues. And here's even a line in that regard. Verse 49, God sent against them God's smoldering fury, anger, indignation, trouble, and a band of messengers of harm. This band of messengers is understood by the commentators as the 10 plagues. But when you go through this, verse 44 has the blood, rivers turning into blood. And at the very end, 51, you get the firstborn. So the first of the 10 plagues, right? Dam, the blood, the Nile turning red. And the last, that's okay. But the middle aren't in order. And there's only a total of 7 plagues. You get Dam, Erov, Sfardea, Arbe, Barad, Dever, and then Bechorot. The 3 plagues that are missing here are lice, shchinim, shchin, boils, and choshech, darkness. Now, some Bible scholars like Moshe Greenberg, who was the head of Bible studies at Hebrew University, years ago, I read an essay, but it only came back to me looking at this issue, said that there were 2 different traditions. Bible scholars often look for the weave. Think of different colors of thread in a rug. And these different colors of thread are different oral traditions. And he said that in the oral tradition of one group, there was only 7 plagues. And the other, there were 5, and they got put together and they got 10. I just read an essay last night that said if you look at Psalm 105, you also get mention of the plagues, but there you get all 10 plagues. Here you only get 7. And the author of this Yale Divinity School essay said that the 3 plagues excluded here were the priestly plagues, the P, and that the J is what's here. Robert Alter, who wrote that wonderful translation of the Bible, professor at Berkeley, he, in his comment, says he doesn't buy it. That need to define this as coming from 2 different strands. Rather, he says, this is poetry. And the nature of poetry is that there will be a picking and a choosing for emphasis. And that he feels that you need not do a linear kind of where did it come from analysis. Back to poetry, a couple of additional thoughts. I'm always fascinated by, and I've had to look up the second part of the word again, hapax legumenon, which is the word in Greek for, a unique word. Verse 47, amidst this description, the sycamores, so God destroyed their vines with the hail and their sycamores with the frost. First, this detail doesn't appear anywhere in the Bible, verse 47. That's another example of the poetic nature of this telling. There are details that are not necessarily found elsewhere. And then this last word, chanamal, widely, commonly, is translated as frost, because that's what it would take to destroy a sycamore tree, usually. But it doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible. And so Steinsaltz will translate it as worms. The Mitsuda, which I like so much, a little Orthodox translation, they will keep it as Hanamel. They won't even translate it, and then put in the footnote a species of locust, which is to say there are words used in most of our Psalms. It's not uncommon that are uniquely used in Tanakh, in Hebrew scripture, in a psalm. One other thing I found interesting in terms of the translation is I've mentioned before that it's always not clear whether a he is a capital H or a small h. This occurs in 2 cases in this psalm, with some seeing the reference to God and others to a human being. So verse 20, behold, I always put in parentheses God when it's a pronoun as a he, so that it's, for me, feeling more like a flow to my ear about God, that God's not given gender. So, behold, he struck the rock and waters flowed out. There, in this regard, the he, Radak, Rabbi David Kimchi, he says that refers to Moses. Moses struck the rock. We know that story. It appears twice, Exodus 17 and Numbers 20. And so the Art Scroll, this Orthodox translation, has it as a small h. But every other translation I read has it as a capital H, referring to God. So that's, again, one of the things that's interesting about translation. And you get the same phenomenon of understanding, is it God or a human being referred to, in verse 72. So it's the last line. And he shepherded them with integrity of his heart. Now, I put down, as do most of the comments, that this is about David. And I emphasized that God will twice be described as shepherd, and now David will be. And David is mentioned explicitly in verse 70. But do know that Steinsaltz and this big book by Rosenberg and Slotowitz, they make it a capital for 72. And God shepherded them with integrity of his heart, and his skillful palms led them, so as to conclude with God. But the majority of commentators see it as continuing to talk about David. But I'm, as somebody who's been engaged in this translation project, fascinated by how translations are interpretations. Here's a little play in terms of being there's so many things to be said in this. And because it's a little bit longer, I'm just going to go an extra few minutes. But here, and with skillful palms led them. Sometimes palms is used for hands, but sometimes there's a nuance. So Samson Raphael Hirsch, Germany, Frankfurt, 19th century, will say hands like we saw yesterday. Show me your right. Show me your right hand, God. Hand is power. Palm is for caressing, for caring. You can see the shepherd patting the sheep. With skillful palms led them. That's what Samson Raphael Hirsch says, that the shift from hand, yad, to kapav is purposeful. Back to the beginning, just a few more. There's so much, of course, in this. I chose to leave this. First, listen to the rhythm. Again, that's where translations are not the same power as the original in terms of rhythm and sound. Look how this opens up. And again, Moses, in his closing speech to the people, Ha'azinu hashamayim medabrim, listen up heavens and I will speak. This here has the same word, ha'azina, as if the psalmist, who throughout this psalm, it's assumed that the hearer knows the Bible, and words chosen resonate with other passages in the Bible. And so this has, from the very get-go, with the choice of the word ha'azina, and it gets repeated in that first word, which means give ear, is a sense that this is meant to go across generations. That's ha'azinu is among the closing chapters of Deuteronomy. It's Moses' farewell speech intended to be heard across generations. So that's echoing here at the very beginning. But listen to the sound. Ha'azina ami Torati. Hatu aznechem li'imrei fi. Eftecha v'mashal pi. Abi achidot mini kedem. So there's a rhythm, that E sound, which is in some cases my being repeated. And there'll be word plays throughout the psalm. But one thing to point out that's a key message. I pointed out the middle verses. Check this out. This is how artfully this is written. Verse 40 and 41 has a reoccurrence of two words. Verse 40, how did they rebel? And verse 41 is the middle. And they turned back. And they turned back and they tested God, right? But here it's a verse that says rebelled, and then the next verse says turned back. That'll occur 3 times. This is at the very middle, but it'll occur earlier. One second, too many notes. So verses 17 and 18, you get the same thing. It's split between two verses. 17, they rebel, lamrot, and then there is lish'al. There's a turning or an asking. And verse 56. And that's the one where they tested, v'yamru, and they rebelled, and then another word, but v'yasugu, they turned back. So that's another rhythm 3 times. Testing, turning back. So now to focus, and then I'll pull it together. There is so much to show you in terms of the poetic weave. Here, I can't help it as I move forward. Verse 33, here's a word play in sound. So their years, verse 33, let me read it. Vaychal bahevel yemehem ushnotam behala. So bahevel means with breath or vapor or vanity. So their years were ended. Behala sounds like it's the same word, but it's a different word meaning terror, leave hold, to become shocked. And so there's a lot of wordplay. But let me end, and then you can maybe ask questions with what we opened with in terms of V'hu rachum v'yechaper v'lo yashchit, verse 38. I close with this, and then because this is the verse from this psalm that's best known. It's the opening every night to our evening prayers. And look what it means. But God is compassionate, forgives iniquity, does not destroy, and repeatedly turns away anger and does not arouse all God's fury. It's the opening line even before the call to prayer, the Barchu. We say verse 38, which also appears in the daily Psukei de Zimra, the introductory prayers, and on Monday and Thursdays to the elongated Tachanun, words of supplication. But this line is every night repeated. Night is a time of foreboding, of fear. And even before we call on God, we remind God by quoting this psalm that God forgives iniquity, repeatedly turns away anger. To say, God, I am feeling nervous at night. I am aware of my shortcomings. But as described in this psalm where God repeatedly turns back to the rebels, may you turn to me. Now hear my prayer. Knowing the context for this only adds to its significance when we say it at night. So if you're in an evening minyan and it opens with these words, turn back to Psalm 78, to that second of the longest Psalms, that remembering of God's willingness to remember and the failure of the people to remember, leading to their distancing from God, and yet God with Torah, which is the opening image, and with David, the closing image, pointing toward a stability of relationship. So with that, I'm going to turn to see you on my screen, and I want to say that it's great to have Ingrid on the screen, and Marion and Daphna and Shirley, Mary, each of you. Jackie and Arnold, any thoughts, any prompts that you might have for me to further unpack Psalm 78, puzzles concerning days of old? Rabbi Podwal, go ahead.
Well, this phrase is in our High Holiday liturgy from Jeremiah, Haben Yakir li Ephraim.
Yes.
I mean, this is a small aspect of this huge psalm. My dear Ephraim.
Yeah.
And then here we talk about the untrustworthiness of Ephraim. So overall, what is the connotation when we think of Ephraim? What should we think of? The untrustworthiness, or
So,
he's beloved of God?
so I'm really glad that you recall that um, from the Haftorah, um, because Ephraim, the first thing we're to recall, as in that context, is Ephraim remembers the 10 northern tribes. So Ephraim becomes the stand in, the concretization, the representative of the 10 tribes. But what also you trigger for me, Shalom, is that's Jeremiah, who lived at the time of the destruction of the first temple. And again, I think sometimes scholars read into poetry to try to date it, because in this case, they try to date it very early because of the mention of Ephraim. But as we see there, Jeremiah is much later. He's not the time of David. He's, 500 years later. So that's the second piece. But the third is the way Ephraim is used here. And that is, Ephraim is used in Psalm 78 to say, remember, you who are of Judah. He's speaking to Judah. He's speaking in the temple. Robert Alter will emphasize this is a maskil. Maskil means a pedagogy. It's a teaching. It's not a liturgy. Though Robert Alter will say it was probably chanted publicly at periodic ceremonies to recall the people's past. And Ephraim and the 10 tribes that were dispersed by the Assyrians in the year 722, they represent the caution. This could happen to you too. But God rejected them because that's the biblical motif, because of a failure of faithfulness. Therefore, you need to be unlike them, faithful. Last comment in terms of that association that was pointed out to me by my teacher and friend, Rabbi Jack Reamer. And that is in that Haftorah of Jeremiah that Rabbi Podwal has referenced, it's Leah who is crying for her children. And now I'm probably am I mixing my Haftorahs? No, I may be mixing my Haftorahs. But Ephraim, I'm mixing. Scratch that, stay with the 4 teachings I just had. So thank you. Any other thoughts? Cantor Shula.
A couple of little language things, because I always love language.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a couple of references as in 33, Bahevel,
Yes.
and in 39, Ruach Holech Velo Yashuv, to the Adonai Ma'adam psalm, which I consider very beautiful. Also, I agree that the Ha'azinu opening gives it gravitas. I think he just realized if he starts like this and they know, everybody will listen. But here's just a fun little thing, talking about Bisde Tzoan.
Yes.
The Hebrew word today for gypsy is Tzoani.
Huh.
That is what we call gypsies, Tzoani. So I'm guessing that Tzoan has come to be almost a category of someone unruly, someone not belonging or slightly unworthy. It is almost not so nice term, but the actual word for gypsy is Tzoani, Tzadi Ayin Nun Yud.
Well, that's very interesting. So a couple of associations in that regard. Here, Zohan becomes a place that is identified by commentators as the capital at a certain point of Egypt, which is not unlike Ephraim, meaning it's being used here to represent Egypt or the power of Egypt. And that's why it's repeated twice, although it doesn't seem to be of any great significance elsewhere in the Bible. But you're, Shula, pointing out in modern Hebrew, which I didn't know, a gypsy is Tzohan, might be where the movie Tzohan image comes from. He's a hairstylist. So
Right.
maybe
I
he's,
saw it. Yeah,
the writer may be suggesting he's gypsy-like.
maybe.
But
Yeah.
maybe.
But I thought it was a fun thing to know.
Yeah, thank you. I learned. So, Arnold, go ahead.
When I think of the word Torah, I think of the 5 books,
Yes.
or maybe earlier 4 books. But at the time of David, what was vacation of the Torah, or were the compilations of stories of the tales taught that told around the campfire, and I'm wondering if that word, the word Torah in the first line or two struck me. I'm wondering if it would it be more considered a teaching as opposed to Torah, which again to me is something that books that are codified.
So, very important question on many levels. Arnold asks, why in verse 1 and verse 5 the word Torah is used? What is it signifying? In almost every translation, Arnold, per your sensitivity, it's translated as instruction. That's what lahorot, to teach, has the root Torah. Torah simply means a teaching. The only translation that I saw that left it as Torah, which was my inclination, and then I was affirmed, was the Art Scroll. Now, Art Scroll, again, being ultra-Orthodox in orientation, sees Torah as eternal. They don't have the historical lens you just brought, but I kept it as Torah in my translation with a capital T to create attention, because Torah, as used in modern language, refers to the Book of the Covenant, the 5 books of Moses. It can also refer to the entire Hebrew scripture, and even more in later days, Torah means wisdom. That's good Torah. When somebody says something wise, in religious circles, you'll say, that's good Torah, regardless of what the wisdom is. It equals any wisdom because ultimately all wisdom comes from God. And so I kept Torah because I like the tension of Torah with a capital T. But your point is well taken, that translations tend to put instruction, not the word Torah. And last, when did the Torah get codified, the 5 books of Moses? It's not clear when. The oldest text we have in writing is the 1st century before the Common Era, Dead Sea Scrolls, but it was during the time of the First Temple that it probably got put together. Clearly, the audience knew Torah, and there are many lines here that either get quoted, you don't know sometimes which comes first. So I mentioned at the outset to Hal, verse 64 has 3 words, Va'almenotav lo tivkena, and their widows did not weep. That phrase appears in one other place, and that's Job 27:15. And you don't know if Job came first or the Psalm came first in terms of who's quoting who. But what is true about Psalm 78 is there will be many quotes or phrases from the 5 books of Moses in recounting, but selective and out of order. All right, I'll take one more comment by Alex, and then I'll look to pull Psalm 78 together.
Doesn't anybody else find this psalm to be, really negative, one-sided against the Ephraim tribes, against the northern tribes?
Yeah.
And really, are they expected to be among the audience for this psalm, or was this psalm just directed for the Judah tribes?
So I'm glad you asked the question, Alex. It builds on Rabbi Podwall's question about Ephraim and the link to Jeremiah, who will refer to Ephraim as Yakirli, my beloved child. That's God speaking in Jeremiah about Ephraim, hundreds of years after the expulsion, which is a way to say, because that's a messianic image of Jeremiah, that God looks forward to bringing all of God's children back together. In that regard, Ephraim in Jeremiah is Yakirli, is beloved. Here in Psalm 78, Ephraim is the bad guy, the bad tribe, the don't do what they did tribe. And we don't know when this was written in the exact context, but what clearly is true of the trajectory of this psalm is this psalm leads to the elevation of Judah and Zion, and the analogy made at the very end. God built like the heights, God's holy place, like the earth that God has founded forever. So just like the earth is enduring forever, so is God's temple, God's holy place, identified with David, Mount Zion, David's holy mountain, although the temple will be built by his son. So in this case, Alex, Ephraim is the cautionary tale. Don't be unfaithful like them, but be faithful like King David, my shepherd. And that's the trajectory. As God is a shepherd, so David becomes the shepherd, hope looking forward. And that also might be why this is an early psalm, because David's kingdom will yet fall apart. Ephraim, of course, will only be sent away, those 10 tribes, long after King David, which also could mean why this was written not in the David time, but after roughly the year, again, it's 722 that the temple is destroyed. I think it's 791 that scholars, no, I don't remember the exact year in which, 791 is when the 10 tribes are cast away, roughly. So somewhere it's early-ish. It may be before the destruction of the first temple, earlier than the destruction of the first temple. There isn't here the celebration of the creation of the temple, rather than, as in many of the Psalms, the longing for the destroyed temple. So there's so much more to say, and it is our tradition that one should always finish studying with the feeling of being incomplete. So when you get to the end of Torah, you never stop, you start over with the messages you never really got to the end. There is a lot of remarkable word plays and art in how this in how this psalm is composed. Next week I will be teaching, and I was sharing it with Mimi Goldstein at the beginning. I'll be teaching next week because we're here, and because I do love this opportunity to be with you and share. For me, that is vacation-like celebration, and I am intent to get all the way to 150 with your encouragement, which means I got to keep it going. And so next week there will be hopefully 3 classes. They're shorter psalms. Here's a tease for Psalm 79, which I began to prepare yesterday. When we open the door for Elijah at our Seders, we say, may God pour God's fury out on the nations. V'shafach chamatcha al hagoyim. We do that a little cringing because, we're referring like God's we're saying we're not afraid of you, our neighbors. May God's wrath be poured out on you. It's at the center of our Seder. That's a line from Psalm 79. And not unlike today, to read it in its context is to add context at your Seder next year, and raises the question very specifically with V'shafach chamatcha, pour out your wrath. How do we take these words of a particular time and how do we echo them across generations out of context, and what do those strong words come to mean? So that'll be some of the play on Tuesday with Psalm 79. To everybody, days of light to all, and
Amen.
goodness. Be well.
Kaddish, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Mimi. We honor our loved ones with closing with the Kaddish, the opportunity to say Amen. Yitkadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah,
Amen.
bi'alma dibra
B'yamach
kiratei,
kiratei
bi'yamlich malchutei, b'chayechon u'yomechon u'chayei dechol beit Yisrael, ba'agala u'vizman kari v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehesh me Rabba Mibarach, Leolam Omeo Maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach, v'yipa'ar v'yitromam v'yitnaseh, v'yitadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal, shemei dekudsha barichu, le'ela minkol birchata v'shirata, tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran bialma v'imru Amen.
Amen.
Yehi Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya V'chayim Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'imru Amen.
Amen.
Osei Shalom B'ramav Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu V'al Kol Yisrael V'kol Yoshvei Tevel V'imru Amen.
Amen.
So if you were wondering, well, what is the longest of the Psalms? If this is the second to longest, this is 76. The longest Psalm is this is 72, is Psalm 119, 176 verses. That one we'll spend 2 days with. 176, and it's acrostic many times for each letter. But that's up ahead to all. Be well. We've already crossed the second longest Psalm, so we accomplished a lot today. So be well.